Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about Cloudflare containers and the fact that it's a brand new product from Cloudflare. I want to share my experience setting it up, some of the things that I like about it, some things that I don't like about it. I want to actually compare that to Azure Container Apps, which is what I'm most familiar with. And I want to give sort of like a head-to-head comparison. The idea is to compare this new approach to containers, which is containers at the edge, which is what Cloudflare is promising, versus traditional container type application. So we're going to go through that. I'll give you some of the key lessons that I learned along the way, and I'll also share some of the challenges I had in terms of getting the actual container set up and running. There's definitely some improvements that can be done to sort of smooth out the experience with Cloudflare. Stick around towards the end and I'll talk about that. Let me just back up a little bit and just give a rough overview about Cloudflare and why this topic is so interesting to me. So first of all, I've been a .NET developer for about 20 years now. Geez, I'm getting old. But that's besides the point. Anyway, I've always been a traditional client server type of developer, and Cloudflare is forcing me to rethink that model. Over the last year or two, I started using Cloudflare more and more. I started sort of doubling down on Cloudflare specific features. I gotta say, I'm really impressed overall with the direction and mindset shift that is happening within Cloudflare. That being said, if you're coming from a traditional background, there's kind of a learning curve and it's sort of a paradigm shift in the way you think about things. In this channel, I plan to share my raw experience with that. If that's something of interest to you, feel free to subscribe, and we're just going to just really talk code, because what I've noticed with some of the developers or some of the videos that I've been seeing is they're basically just doing these demo apps, things they don't use in production. What I promise you is that I'm going to do real world development, and I'll show you real world code for as much as I possibly can. I want to apply some of these things I'm learning with Cloudflare to real use cases that I actually have in the open right now, and share those experiences. Some will be good, some will be bad. If that's the type of thing you're interested in, then stick around. So let me just back up and just talk quickly about Cloudflare, what their goals are. So Cloudflare, overall, their mission is to have essentially the fastest web experience possible. And the only way to do that is to physically move servers closest to the users. So I'm in Toronto. If I were to log on to Cloudflare's website, the server probably is either in the same city or very close. As a result of that very short distance, moving at the speed of light, you're able to get a super fast response. Cloudflare has a ton of these networks throughout the globe. One of the things that I really like about them is that when you do a deployment, you deploy to Earth. That's it. It just goes everywhere. Now, there are some asterisks there. I'll talk about that in this video, specifically with containers. But for the most part, you're deploying to region Earth. And that's a different paradigm shift from the model we've been accustomed to. If you're running servers in a more traditional sense, you have to pick a data center in a specific region or fail over to a specific region, etc. So I've been more and more buying into this idea of just deploying, and it's just everywhere all at once all the time. And so I really like that concept, which is exactly why I'm exploring this sort of containerized model. So with that as a background, let's talk about how and what exactly I'm building, just to give some rough context and show you that what I'm talking about is a real world application that I'm solving a real world problem for. And then we'll talk about sort of the experience overall with the Cloudflare. So I have here my actual product. So I'm a software developer. I run a company called SnapSuite. It helps people, contractors, with project management, scheduling, billing, all that type of good stuff. If you're interested in that, check my bio for more details. What happens is this document in the background in real time prints a Microsoft Word document, converts it to a PDF, and then shows you that document. So if the change that I just made in the time that I just clicked on that button, I had literally physically opened up a Microsoft Word document, import that data, converted it to a PDF, and then showed it to me. It's not a very sophisticated system from its core, but it's a real world use case that I could show you. There's a fundamental flaw with that program. The program has been around for a really long time. And let me show you the back end so you can get some perspective. So in the background, without going into too much details, and I'll have to blur some of this stuff out, but without going into too much details, there's literally a console application that's running on a Windows server, on a server based on load time. Multiple servers spin up in Azure to kind of take care of the load. And then whenever it's off peak hours, it kind of just scales down. And so you got this sort of dynamic loading up and down. And essentially what happens is there's a queue that takes in requests, and it physically opens up Microsoft Word. See, there's a problem with the license because it's sort of an old thing and I haven't been updated, we're coming off of this server, but I just wanted to give you a real world example. This console app literally just opens up that Microsoft Word document, puts the data inside of it, closes it, saves it, and then uploads it back to the cloud. It just keeps doing that all day long. And it's fairly reliable. It crashes maybe once or twice a year. Like it's very, very reliable and stable. That being said though, it's extremely inefficient from the process of just being able to manage from a cloud perspective. That's how I would describe it. What do I mean by that? Average, one of these servers costs about $400 per server, and that server spins up during the day, 3 or 4 of them running at any given time. Some on peak loads will have like 5 of them running at a time. So to give some rough numbers, for every 10 customers that we have, it costs about $1,000 in just print because of the queue. And the reason why that cost kind of exceed is because the print service is actually pretty slow. On average, it's about 5 to 10 seconds for a print to actually go through. The main reason is the server runs nonstop all the time, and it's just consuming resources. Even though it might be during the 9 to 5 hours, it's not all the time that somebody's printing. People are printing invoices or quotations. And as a result, the server, most of the time, I would argue 60%, maybe even 70% of the time, it sits idle. So you're just paying for all this cost. So as a result, I've been on a goal to shift that into a more efficient model. We spent the time redesigning the entire application. I did that last year to redesign that entire system into a Linux container. And without going into too much details, it's a significantly better system. It's a Dockerized system. So it's no longer dependent on Windows. Microsoft Office is dependent on open source technology, which I won't go into in this video. I'll talk about that in another video. The point is that it's a Linux container in Docker that spins up and spins down to print a document. And I just want to give you an example of that. This is now using Azure Container Apps. And again, just to do a direct comparison between what I deployed in Azure Container Apps and Cloudflare containers, so you can have some comparison. The reason why I'm going to click the button in a bit, but what I want you to pay attention to is just the time it takes to load up. I might speed up this section a little bit, but overall, we're coming from a complete dead cold start, no servers running, so scale to 0. And what's going to happen is it takes about 30 seconds or so. It's going to spin up the server, and then it's going to take in that request. It has a default request, and it'll try to process it. And then it's going to give me a Microsoft Word document and a PDF document. Okay. So the takeaway here is that the Azure Container Apps eliminates the need to have a server running all the time. That being said, while I like Azure, I like the idea of having an edge network. So the container running closest to the user, that might have some real benefits. And again, this is why I'm testing to see what that would look like. So if you notice, the first request took 38 seconds. Most of the time was spent waiting for that document to load. Now, if I press that again, because that server is now up and running, you'll see that it should be significantly faster. So 1.45 seconds, press it again, 1.4 seconds on average. So it takes about 1.5 seconds to process the document and upload it to the storage location. And just to give you an idea of what that document looks like, I'll just pull this link out and we'll just, there. So that's basically what this document looks like altogether. Now, let's talk about the Cloudflare version. I took that entire Docker application, which has quite a bit of moving parts in terms of a code base. It's a pretty big application. There's lots of moving parts. It's a complete rewrite of an architecture of an older application. And you can see here, There's quite a bit of modules. This is a .NET application running in Docker. So there's quite a bit of moving parts. And so it was a bit hard for me to set this up in Cloudflare. But again, I just wanted to level set to show you what the application is that I'm working with, so you could understand that this is not a fly-by-night sort of like basic sort of to-do list setup that I was doing with Cloudflare. So with that, I'm going to run the exact same thing with Cloudflare just to show you the difference. Again, cold start, 100% cold start from Cloudflare. So I'm going to press the print button. Now, keep in mind that with the Cloudflare version, it's not an apples to apples comparison because the Cloudflare only gives you about half a CPU. Now, that being said though, if you notice, it's only 13 seconds on the Cloudflare spin up. So that's actually significantly faster. That's from 0. So so with Cloudflare, it's about half the time to go from complete dead cold start, absolute zero service running, to a full spin up is about 13 seconds. Now, here's what's interesting about it. If I click on the send again, because the processor is a lot smaller, it's taking about 5 seconds. So while Azure takes a lot longer to actually get the first document up when the server is like dead, subsequent requests is significantly faster because it's just a faster server. However, in my experience with Azure, 4 vCPUs, generally speaking, performs less than a Google equivalent or AWS equivalent. I don't know why, don't ask me. Azure has less performance, at least that's my experience. So I find this very interesting because this is a CPU that is half of a one CPU in processing power, but yet it's processing the same document, exact same document it's taking 5 seconds, whereas 4 times that in Azure is taking 1 second. Maybe it does work out, but the truth is I actually feel that if I can get even a 2 or 3 virtual CPU in Cloudflare, I'm willing to bet it would outperform Azure's processing time. That's basically where we're at right now. With that, hopefully that's given you some context on what we're actually doing here. Now I'm going to dig in a little bit more into the details of the Cloudflare part of things. So let's just talk about what they're doing. So a couple things. Number one is I'll talk about what I like about it. And I have some notes here to keep on track. What I like about it, number one is the deploy to Earth. It's very appealing. Now they're in beta. So the way you set this up is a little convoluted. You need to have a paid plan of a worker thing. It starts at $5 a month for the paid plan. So that's the first thing, which is fine. Azure is free because they have more, I wouldn't say more generous tier, but you could just start for free. It requires a credit card. So I have this container. It's a Cloudflare test. I'm going to delete all this stuff as soon as I finish this video. What I like about it is that you can see CPU time because they're charging for CPU time versus wall time, right? So one of the things that's interesting with the Cloudflare model is the wall time is 306 milliseconds. However, they're only charging me for 0.6 seconds, which I find interesting. I like this model better because they're only charging me for the CPU time, not for the wall time. So I guess the time it takes to spin up the actual computer and all that kind of stuff, I'm not being charged for that. Don't quote me on that, but that's my understanding so far. So this dashboard is pretty cool. The thing that I don't necessarily like about the Cloudflare, and it's kind of a laundry list of stuff here that I'm going to go in sort of random order. Number one is it's buried under a worker page. So what I found very confusing about it is that I'm deploying a container, but I have to deploy this worker. The worker is like a router to route data to the container. And then the container is sitting on a durable object. I understand why Cloudflare is doing this because they have this infrastructure and they just add the container on top of it. But I feel like from a usability standpoint, that details need to be abstracted. When I'm working with a container, I should just be working with a container. So let me just give you an example of what I think, how they're doing it. And again, I'm no expert on this because I'm just learning this stuff here. But the way I would describe it is you have a worker. So let's put the Cloudflare worker that takes in requests from external sources. And then in that request, it gets routed to your VM or your container app that gets run inside of the worker. So in here, you need to kind of forward the requests. So let's say you have like a / print, right? I have to route that / print into this container, but I could have / invoice, and that could be routed to something, not a container. That could just be routed to some sort of function inside of my worker. So that's kind of the confusing part about it. It's like, I understand that it's kind of a route request, but I don't care. I don't want to have my cake and eat it too with having the Cloudflare. I get why they're doing it because these two things are kind of tied together, but I feel like a container should just be a container. It shouldn't be tied with a worker. That's just my opinion about it. And I'm kind of willing to die on that hill. So as a result, you got this forwarding thing. Now, one of the things that I found a little confusing is the fact that you can put environment variables inside of your worker. And so whatever function it is can read from that environment. Those environment variables are not readily accessible in your container. In your config file, you have to take the environment variable from here and then kind of push them into your container. From my perspective, there's just too many concepts that merge into one here. And I just feel like the Cloudflare team, if you ever see this video, you have to abstract this stuff away because it just gets muddy. All I care about is deploying a container. That's it. I don't care how it works under the hood. If I have a separate worker and I need to talk to my container, there's an interface to do that, and that makes perfect sense, but they shouldn't be merged together, even though under the hood, they're the same thing and they're kind of merged together, which I get, right? There's a difference between the usability and sort of the thing. So anyway, I just wanted to make that point because I spent a lot of time in my experience through Wrangler file just to get it set up. And I won't go into details here. I'm going to try to maybe do another video on this, but with the Wrangler file, there's a lot of merging of concepts. There's this migration. There's this thing. Cloudflare doesn't allow you to do like tag latest. I got a couple errors with that as well. Honestly, if it wasn't for AI, I probably wouldn't have gotten this figured out because of the amount of concept I keep pouring the documentation and keep iterating in order for me to figure out how to get this thing deployed. Even though their quick start was very easy to just spin up. There's this container source folder, and that's where your code should live for your container. However, in my case, all I cared about was my Docker image, pull in my actual .NET code from a completely different source location, and then build in that container to publish it. And that turned out to be a very confusing process. So just wanted to highlight that. One more thing I'll mention, and hopefully this makes a little bit of sense. When you deploy the container, you go into your Cloudflare worker and you deploy the container by doing Wrangler deploy. Okay, that's great. But then I would make a change to the container and do another deployment. Let's pretend I did one right now, like I did Wrangler deploy or npm run deploy. This would still say 4 hours in some cases. The reason was because some of the changes I was making was to like a Wrangler file, or for example, I had this as basic, and that just means this is the smallest container. And I was like, oh, it's not fast enough. It was actually pretty slow. So I changed that to standard. I ran it again. I did another deployment. And then I came in here looking to see if the container had changed, and it still showed 4 hours ago. Last modified. I was like, well, I know I just deployed. Like I got a successful message in my console. It said successful. However, like it's not showing that in the code. So that was also confusing. And I was like, well, it's just not working. Then I came into the worker and saw, okay, actually, it does say, if you go to deployments, you will see that it was actually deployed within that short period of time. So I was like, oh, okay, that's fine. Sure. Whatever. Next thing was, before I was trying to get the container to be built, and I would press send. And what would happen is, I was getting some errors because this thing here uses Azure Key Vault and stuff to store all the secrets, etc. Things that are not necessarily native to Cloudflare, obviously, because they're Azure stuff. And then I get a 500 error. after I figured out how to forward the request. And then I'd come in here to the workers and I click on logs because I want to see my logs for the container. However, this log was extremely limited and there was no way for me to figure out. I was like, where are the logs for my container? Because I'm logging stuff out, console log, whatever. Nothing. Okay. So just going back to that diagram, the logs for the workers are showing up here on the UI dashboard. If you go into the worker, you see those logs, but the container has its own set of logs. So that's also confusing because it's like, well, if the container is part of the worker, then why aren't the logs in the same place? The logs are completely in a separate location. It turns out that in order for you to get those logs, you have to go into containers, and then you click on the actual container, and then you could see the logs for that specific container. And that's when you'll be able to see the difference. So that was just really confusing. The other thing I didn't like was the fact that I can't just clear the log for testing purposes. I wanted to get rid of all the logs so I could just be able to just see what's coming in new, so I could figure out like what's broken, because it was just, and so that was sort of confused. Like I said, I'm kind of jumping around the place here. I'm hoping to get some value from this. This is just my first experience with Cloudflare. I'm not highlighting all this stuff to really just crap on this because I understand it's in beta and it is still being worked out. That being said, though, there's a lot more work to be done here. I just want to give my raw opinion about that in terms of getting this to what I would deem as production ready, right? And again, my experiences with Azure Container Apps, which is a more refined product, it has its own issues. I'll do that in another video, but this particular video, these are some of the challenges that I ran into, especially not being a native Cloudflare person. So I would imagine if you're a Java person or I don't know, Ruby on Rails or something that's not native to Cloudflare, you're not like a Node.js developer, you're not deep in the ecosystem of Cloudflare, I would imagine that these problems you would run into also. So just wanted to highlight that. Okay, this video is getting a little bit long, so let's just wrap it up. Let's talk about the things that could be improved altogether. So number one is the secrets. I talked about that, right? The difference between having secrets in the secret section for the worker versus in the container. I should show that because in the index file, I have access to my environment variables, and then I have to get access to my container. I have to shove those container secrets back into the container. If I'm deploying a container, I just want to put my secrets and just, I don't care about all these details, right? Like it shouldn't have to, anyway, just, yeah, you get the idea. Other complaints is the fact that, you know, this is kind of like a side note, like this, I'm doing .NET. I understand that Cloudflare is not solving for a .NET problem, but ideally it'd be nice if they just had like a preset template out the box so you could just kind of spin that up and it would work altogether. Theoretically speaking, if you have a Docker container, you should be fine. The size is pretty limited right now. So half of a virtual CPU, this is way too small for any of the stuff that I need. Now, that being said, it's pretty fast considering this is a cold start and it was like 13 seconds, if I remember correctly. So that's pretty fast in comparison to .NET that gives me a sort of quote unquote bigger server. It's just not as fast, right? So here, yeah, consistently 13 seconds. And again, comparing that to .NET is probably dead by now. So if I do that, I'm pretty certain it's going to take about 30 to 40 seconds on average. So significantly faster startup time. I don't know if it's going to stay like that. There's one other thing I do want to mention about that, which is, so it's not a full deploy to earth and it's accessible all over all the time. I think right now what they're doing is they're kind of routing to the closest region, right? And I think over time that's going to improve as they roll this out properly. Just keep that in mind. It's not 100% all deployments to all region all the time. It's just like they'll route to the closest region. If I'm in Toronto, I think it's routing to Miami, if I remember correctly. I don't know where I saw that, but it just was stuck in my head. Yeah, and then my last but final sort of like nice to have, I think, is that they just need to clean up this a little bit. Cloudflare UI for the most part is kind of okay. It's definitely not as terrible as AWS. It's closer to Google, which I don't find to be the best UI, by the way, but it's closer to that. So it works. It's not too much of a big issue. I think there's some improvements that could be done on the UI, but definitely, at least in my opinion, huge confusion between this whole worker and containers type stuff. You just need to abstract that away. And it's just a container. All request just comes in from the workers and routes to container. And then you can spin up a worker and have a direct way to access that container somehow. Like, I'm not a developer, so I don't pretend to know how to solve this problem. I'm just saying that from a usability standpoint, that's what has to be done. And then, yeah, what's the takeaway? The question is, would I use this in production? No. I probably took a good 15 seconds to answer that thing. I'll cut that out so you don't have to ponder my thought. I won't use this in production today. A couple things that definitely for me, the scale up, scale down is not as efficient, at least as yet. There seems to be some nuances there. There's a load balancer. You can set it to sort of like the maximum amount of compute. But I think if I understand correctly is that they all have to be running all the time. Compare that to Azure container apps. I could be at 0 and I've tested this. I could hit it with 500 requests as an example. It'll instantly spin up to about 20, not necessarily instantly, but pretty fast within a minute to process all those requests, and it'll automatically do the load balancing. So from my understanding, based on what I've seen so far with the Cloudflare implementation, is you kind of have to still think about load balancing and some of those stuff. I don't think that's going to be the case 100% forever. I think that's just because it's a brand new product. I wouldn't put real production code into that because I'd have to think too much about those details. And with Azure, again, as a comparison, because it's the one that I'm working on closest right now. This video has been pretty long. Hopefully you got some value from this. This is just my first overall experience. If you got some value from it, please like and subscribe. I'll be doing a lot more videos on this type of topics. I'm going to be doubling down on Cloudflare because I'm pretty bullish about what these guys are doing. They're innovating in ways I haven't seen in the last 10 years in this space. I'm pretty bullish about what they're about to bring. So I'm going to keep rolling out more videos. If you guys like it, feel free to subscribe, or at least give me a thumbs up or comment on what you think could be better or change about the video. I'll try to do my best to improve that for the next videos. Thank you for your time. Have yourself a wonderful day. I'll see you in another video.